It's great to be here to speak on migration because this is the land of migration, as many of you out here know. Uh, I started writing this book literally more than 10 years ago when I was working on different aspects of migration, internal migration, international migration, voluntary migration, involuntary migration, male migration, female migration, all sorts of migrations that you can think of. And finally, a few years back, wrote a book called India Moving, A History of Migration. And I'll start, of course, with what is probably on the top of your mind. That is, how is it that people from Kerala reach the Gulf? You know, this whole massive Gulf migration, which is so powerful in the minds of people in Kerala. Though I must mention that Kerala now no longer sends the maximum number of people to the Gulf. That number is now higher in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. So that switch has happened in the last 5 years. But for the last 40 years, everyone in this room, especially those from Kerala, know that something quite dramatic happened. And what this book tries to do is to explain the history. How is it that from virtually nobody in the Gulf, there are millions and millions of people from India and especially Kerala in the Gulf? So let me start with a story on migration of how the Keralites actually reached the Gulf, which tells you a larger story of how migration happens in the first place. Of course, India has been connected with the Gulf for a really long time. But as you know, the massive migration starts happening after the oil boom in the 1970s. Why is it that oil companies started favoring Indian immigrants, and especially from Kerala? It has a very fascinating story, which tells you also a lot about migration. It so happens that when oil was discovered in Persia, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1908, there was a field manager called George Reynolds. And George Reynolds basically wanted workers to extract oil. And because George Reynolds at that time had spent his life in the public works department in British India, he knew Indian labor. And so that's why George Reynolds decided to recruit Indian labor for the Anglo-Iranian company in 1908. And this company over time started recruiting more and more Indians. They started a recruitment office not in Kerala but in Bombay. And when there was a downturn, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, retrenched a lot of workers, and the workers were looking for jobs, so they joined other oil companies. They joined Bahrain Oil Company, Kuwait, the American Arabian Oil Company. And all these oil companies started recruiting people from the city of Bombay. And who were they recruiting in Bombay? They had a particular clause, because these were Arabian nations and foreign multinational oil companies. They had a particular clause saying, we will recruit people of certain religions, of certain ethnicities. And because Christians and Muslims were in large numbers in Bombay, had their roots from Kerala, that's how a lot of Keralite migrants based from Bombay started working in the Gulf countries. And because this huge appetite of labor began to grow and grow over time, you've had recruitment offices then set up in Kerala from the 1940s, 50s. And when the oil boom happened in the 1970s, these recruitment offices were in a terrific position to recruit a large number of people from Kerala. As you know, the numbers are staggering. Remittance to GDP ratio of just the state of Kerala is over 30%. I don't need to explain to you how important Kerala migration is to Kerala. And the remarkable fact that you all also know now, that while there are 2 and 3 million Keralites in the Gulf, there are almost about 2 million people from outside Kerala working inside Kerala. Right? So Kerala is this remarkable place of India where people go, people come. Right? It's this labor market which is completely in flux. So we have a lot of jokes on Keralites around the world, but I currently work in the state of Gujarat. And Gujarat is another place of India where you find the common moniker that you'll find Gujaratis around the world. Right? The Patels and the Motels in the US, the diamond trade of Belgium, East African connection with Gujarat. And one really has to think, how is it that some parts of India started these migration connections much more early on? We never really think of a Madhya Pradeshi found around the world, but we think of a Gujarati or a Keralite around the world. We think of the Bihari around India and around the world. For example, Mauritius. How do we piece together these stories, these migration histories? And in my book, I present a framework to understand these different migrations. And I begin with the most significant, the largest migration that happens in India, which is usually not well known. And that is the migration of women for marriage. It seems so obvious that we don't consider it migration. You don't consider migration for marriage as something being significant, but it is what holds Indian diversity together. We are a society where women's migration for marriage is much higher in terms of rates than most parts of the world. It's much higher in northern India than southern India because of different systems in migration, and the numbers are staggering. Virtually every adult woman in India is a migrant. The census of 2011 shows over 300 million women migrants. Of course, a lot of this is short distance, next village, nearest town, but a lot of it is also interstate, at a certain distance. For example, the phenomenon of the missing women. In Gujarat and Haryana, the sex ratios at birth are skewed in favor of boys, and when they grow up, they realize that there are not enough women in what people call as the marriage market. So where will the women come from? They come from Uttar Pradesh, they come from West Bengal. One of the world's biggest female migration corridors for marriage is from eastern India to western India. And this has been going on for centuries, not something new. You might have heard of the Bihari migrant worker, found in Calcutta 100 years back, found across India in variety of settings. You have songs in films of Kerala now where people speak, people break into Bengali, for instance. Bengali migrant worker, Bihari migrant worker, Eastern Indian migrant workers, how did they start moving? And I'm going to start the story with a little bit of a backstory. And this backstory has many elements. I mentioned women's migration for marriage, which is the world's largest migration system. But if you think of migration for work, a very peculiar kind of work-related migration that has been throughout history, if you just heard Amitav Ghosh speaking, you would have heard him say this, which is slavery. Right? And slavery was not something invented by the Europeans. Slavery was around the world. It was definitely there in India. Virtually every kingdom in Indian history practiced some form of slavery. And these slavery roots, I have a whole section of this in my book, took place in a variety of ways, in a variety of settings. A lot of this was from North India into Central Asia. A lot of this was from Africa via Arabia into India. I'll tell you about one person called Malik Ambar. Malik Ambar is a particular slave who became nobility in the Ahmednagar kingdom in roughly late 1500s, early 1600s. Now, from Ethiopia, sold in Arabia, comes to India. But what's really interesting about a lot of these slave migrations in Indian history is also how many of them can rise up and then become people of the nobility, a lot of upward mobility prospects that you see in Indian history. So this community that Malik Ambar belonged to, what is now known as the Siddhi or the Habshi community, still exists in India. In Ahmedabad, for instance, there's this famous mosque, Jali, called the Siddhi Sayyid Jali. It's one of the beautiful things of the city I work in currently. And my institute, the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, IIM Ahmedabad, our logo comes from the Siddhi Sayyid Jali. Right? So some slave migration 500 years back, the descendants of those migrants doing a variety of things, including artwork, and our institute's logo linked with that. You can see migration all around us in a variety of settings, from our food to our songs. For instance, the Saurashtra Patels, or what you call as the Madurai, not the Saurashtra Patels, the Madurai Saurashtras, for instance, in Tamil Nadu. This is a particular community where at the time of the wedding have to recite a particular ritual. And this ritual is very fascinating. The boy's side and the mother's side have to tell their migration histories, saying, my parents, my father, my mother came from here, my grandmother, my grandfather came from here, and so on. The migration lineage is kind of narrated in this way in these particular traditions. So migration for work, for marriage has been happening from forever. But something dramatic happens in the middle of the 19th century. And that thing is the Indian Railways. Right? The Indian Railways not only makes people move, but it puts people to work and it employs a lot of people who are continuously moving. Even today, one of the world's largest employers. But to build the Indian Railways required tens and tens of thousands of people who started migrating for work. And once the railways was built in the 1850s, and as the network expanded over the late 19th century, for the first time, the speed barrier, which was always held by the speed of the river or the speed of the horse, was broken. And for the first time, migrants could now moving much faster. And you got this peculiar notion of what we now call as seasonal migration, where suddenly you could work in Calcutta or Bombay or Mysore or Bangalore, but you didn't have to settle down there. You could also come back. A feature, of course, people in Kerala know what is known as circular migration. And from the late 19th century, a particular kind of migration starts to appear, which I call the Great Indian Migration Wave. So what is this Great Indian Migration Wave all about? It's the world's largest voluntary migration system for work. And which parts of India does it affect? Kerala, of course, is a core part of this story, but you have Bihar, you have Eastern Uttar Pradesh, you have a few districts of Punjab. Broadly speaking, a large part of coastal India, and when I mean coast, literally the districts along the coast. For instance, from Kanyakumari, literally to Ratnagiri, almost the entire stretch today, if you take a lovely drive along this road, you will find two things: Western Union boards, because so many people go outside and send back money, and a continuous cry on shortage of labor because people have moved out. This is not one of the poorest parts of India today. Kerala is not one of the poorest parts of India. And yet, one of the richest parts of India today, Kerala, and one of the poorest parts of India today, Bihar, have the same rates of outmigration. So if you thought, why do people move for work? They are poor. It's much more than that, right? And the core part that I want to convey out here is the power of the network, right? It is about a culture of migration which develops over time, which means as you grow up in a district like Saran in Bihar or a district like Malappuram in Kerala, it is very different from growing up in a district in central Madhya Pradesh, because you know how to move. You know what it means to migrate. You know you have an aspiration to move, which means that even if there are opportunities back home, there is something much more. It's not just a pure economic factor. There's peer pressure. There's an aspiration to move, and equally an aspiration to come back, which is why we say this is a circular migration. And you find a lot of people in India who spend their lives outside, but return back in their retirement house back home. This affects, of course, many of you here. But think of security guards, think of the entire urban informal economy today, where a large part of this workforce is what we call migration researchers as circular migrant workers. And this number in India today is over 100 million people. That makes it the world's largest migration system. So what's the history of this? Why is it that we see particular clusters grow into this thing? Why is it that much of the Deccan Plateau, for instance, has been locked out of these migration histories? Why is it that the West Coast, and I said again, just the West Coast, you cross the Western Ghats and you find no migration culture, very little. You go from Ratnagiri to Satara, just across the Western Ghats in Maharashtra, and you don't find this migration buzz. Everyone in Ratnagiri wants to go out. As we say that famous joke, Ratnagiri, for you folks, you probably heard of Ratnagiri in terms of mangoes, the famous Alfonso mangoes. In the world of migration, it's known for man-goes, right? So they just, a lot of migration which happens from Ratnagiri. And the sex ratio of Ratnagiri has been elevated, which means it's had this phenomenon of missing men from the late 19th century. It's had a sex ratio about 1,200 females to 1,000 males for more than 110 years. This is not a new phenomenon. The Kerala migration story is relatively more recent in extremity, but there are districts from Kerala, again, which go back in terms of mass outmigration from the late 19th century. Goa today is a region many of you might think people go towards, but there are still taluks in Goa where a lot of people move from. They work in the merchant navy. And Goa was a massive remittance economy until the 1960s. So the entire West Coast, and as you move along the East Coast, you have Sivaganga, a few districts of Tamil Nadu, who also send a lot of people out even today. Then there's a gap on the East Coast, and then you reach Odisha, and you have coastal Odisha. You have districts like Ganjam, like Brahmapur. And where are those folks going? Their folks are taking the Puri-Oka Express, one of the longest train rides of India, and going all across to Gujarat today to work. It's a 3-day train ride. There are hundreds of thousands of people from coastal Odisha who work in Gujarat. And these folks have been moving now for more than 100 years. Gujarat is new, but the earlier destination was Burma. Right? So, and that is why you have a lot of Burmese connection on the east coast of India. So just like you have Dubai today, which is a big magnet for Indians, 100 years back, that city was Rangoon. Hence, you have this famous song, "Mere piya gaye Rangoon, wahan se kiya hai telephone, tumhari yaad aati hai." Right? You have a lot of these connections of Burma. And why? Because Burma, Malaysia, and Sri Lanka absorbed a huge amount of migrants in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In fact, from about 1830s to about 1920s, over 40 million Indians left Indian shores. Of course, most even came back. But which districts did they go from? They went from districts like districts in Kerala, districts in coastal Odisha, particular districts. And once those networks were formed, they proved to be so powerful and resilient that people out there realized that migration can be a very secure source of income. Think of coastal Odisha. You have these cyclones and super cyclones all the time. Migration is much more stable as a source of income than anything else. In Kerala, for 40 years, people have said we should not be so overly reliant on the Gulf economy. If the Gulf collapses, Kerala collapses. But the fact is that the Gulf economy now is so intertwined with Indian migrants that they simply cannot afford to work without Indians. And that is why all calls for ending migration and so on have not really worked. The 1991 crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, because the power of networks and more importantly now, the power of intertwining. Right? So, different districts of India. I'll talk a little bit about Bihar because many of you know the stories about the famous Bihari migrant worker. Districts in Bihar, for instance, have been associated with mass migration well before the 19th century. In some districts, you can trace it from the 16th century. They supplied soldiers in various armies. But from the late 19th century, they start supplying a large number of people to two main areas. One are the British plantations around the world. For instance, Mauritius, for instance, Fiji, the Caribbean islands, right? What we call as indentured labor. But most of those who went did not go on indentured labor. They went pretty much out of their free will. We have a notion that a lot of people were sucked out by the British, and yes, there was a lot of exploitation, just like there's a lot of exploitation in the Gulf. But people are fairly rational when they make choices. They're comparing about how much return they can get from migration vis-a-vis a lot of the costs that they see around. In the late 19th century, the choice was an evil document called the indenture contract or a hideous labor market where you faced extreme sense of caste oppression. A lot of people chose indenture. They were not forced into indenture. And in any case, indenture was a very small aspect of overall migration in this time period. And that is why when indenture was abolished, Gandhi fought heavily to abolish indentured migration. Migration from those places never stopped. They continued to move because the pressure was very there. You go to the Himalayan world, Uttarakhand, Himachal, today you'll see empty houses. The men are working, or even the women are working in Delhi in large numbers, right? Uttarakhand, the Himalayan economy, and extend that to Nepal, is a massive remittance economy today. So to take you through a map of India, the west coast of India, parts of the east coast, parts of the Gangetic Valley, eastern UP, Bihar, then you have a few districts in Punjab like Jalandhar, Hoshiarpur, where, as you know, a lot of people go to Canada, and now Italy. You know, Italy has about 200,000 Indians, most of them coming from a few districts of Punjab. And all these districts put together are about 150 to 200 districts out of 700 odd districts of India, which have a migration bug, what I call as the Great Indian Migration Wave. They move not purely out of economic opportunities, though that's the stated reason. It's much more than that, which means even if opportunities develop back home, it will take a long time for these migrations to switch because the cultures are so strong, institutions are built around migration, people grow up with a huge aspiration to move. This story is mainly male-dominated. Many more men move in these streams than women. Though, of course, in Kerala, you have a huge migration of nurses and a lot of occupations. But even from Kerala to Gulf, the bulk of the migration is male-dominated, right? Because men are moving more, women are back home, families are back home, it creates the remittance economy. A lot of people think that the railways is the most important institution in the world of migrant workers, migration for the last 100 years or so. I would argue it's actually been the post office. Today we don't think of the post office. Nobody really goes to the post office to send letters. But when the post office started the money order system in the year 1880, it was a financial revolution. For the first time, you could work far away in Mauritius and send back money to your home in very, very rural parts and remote parts of India. And because women were not allowed to go to these post offices, the Postal Department of India changed their delivery systems so that money could actually be delivered at your house. In most cases, like Western Union, you have to go to the office to pick up money. The Post Office of India from 1884 until very recently, when they shut down the service, had this unique system of home delivery of cash. The post person would come to your house and give you cash at your house. Right? The postal remittance to GDP ratio was about 2 to 3% in India in the early 20th century, which tells you how important the domestic remittance economy of India has always been. It continues to be, though nobody really uses the post office today. You use your mobile phone, use various other ways to transfer money back home. So remittance culture has been a huge part of this great Indian migration wave. And a lot of times I get this question, when will this end? When will the mass migration from Kerala to the Gulf end? Or is it ending? When will the mass migration from Bihar end? And so we have to go back to the roots. What explains why the poorest parts of India and the richest parts of India have the same rates of outmigration? And the root cause of migration in many parts of the world, and especially in India, is something called as population density, but rural population density. What's common between Kerala and Bihar is extremely high rural population density. And there's only that much that agriculture can support when you have something like 5,000 to 10,000 people per square kilometers. Central Madhya Pradesh does not have that massive pressure on land. And that is why the need to go out is still so strong. And the need to go out will only go down only when the population pressure goes down, which in the case of Kerala is starting to happen, because population growth rates are now going to start crashing because fertility rates have crashed. In a sense, until fertility rates crashed in the last 20 years in many parts of India, there was always a steady growth of population. And that steady growth of population always put a pressure on land. So in 30 years from now, it's quite likely that you'll find very few Keralites, or the outmigration rate of Kerala would have dipped substantially for the simple reason that Keralites are having fewer kids. But not the same with Bihar. And so whatever happens in Bihar in terms of economic development, the Bihari outmigration story is here to stay for another 5 decades. They'll find new destinations, but it is here to stay. Bengal is another classic place which has emerged into the great Indian migration wave. Now, is this a good thing or a bad thing that people move for work? Often people say it's a reflection that there are no opportunities. But the fact is that in many parts of India, when development, in however you define, has come to these places, you get the paradoxical outcome of more outmigration, not less. For example, coastal Andhra Pradesh, one of the most fertile tracts of India, agricultural prosperity much more than most parts of India. What do people do with that money? They move to the nearby towns, then you go to Hyderabad, and eventually the dream of people in coastal Andhra Pradesh to have a tie with the United States of America. People have aspirations which will not die down if you have a rubric that rural development will stop outmigration. That has never worked in any country. In many parts of India, with more development, you got more outmigration. And that is why we have to stop thinking in terms of outmigration as a symptom necessarily of things gone wrong, because it can mean something much more. How much time do I have? I have about 20 minutes. I'm going to talk about different types of migration. I talked about labor, people moving for work at different ends of the labor market. I'll now talk about migration of capital. Right? That is, people who do business, people who are called capitalists. Let me use that word in Kerala. And in India, interestingly, a few communities have dominated the world of capital. For instance, a study of about 10,000 directors of, 9,000 to 10,000 directors of India's 1,000 largest companies shows that about 45% of them are what we call as Banyas, and 45% of them are what we call as Brahmins. 90% of our corporate elite is Brahmin or Banya. And these are India's 1,000 largest companies, data from about 5 to 10 years back. Why is it that a few communities, what we call as banyas, and more popularly, you might have known regional specific words like the Marwadis, the Gujaratis, the Sindhis, not Banya but Parsi, another word with the Tatars we typically associate. South India, only one community that historically comes to mind is the Chettiars. Some of you might have heard of the Chettiar community, huge financial empire in Burma, in Southeast Asia. But the core of business dominance in India, for example, the 100 richest people, 50 of them happen to be Gujarati and Marwadi. Right? Why is it that a few groups from a few parts of India dominate the world of Indian business? You cannot understand that without understanding the history of the migration of these groups. So let me start with Marwadis, which are one of the most successful and dominant groups in India. The Marwadis, most Marwadis are in fact not Marwadis, in the sense that they do not trace their origins to the region called Marwar. Rajasthan has three parts, Shekhawat, Marwar and Mewar. And most Marwadis like Birla and Bits Pilani, for instance, belong to a place called Shekhawat. They were called Marwadis because when they were found in Calcutta by the British, many of them spoke the language which they dubbed as Marwadi. But in terms of geographical specificity, they come from a region called Shekhawat, and they started migrating, not in the 19th century, but from the 17th century in large numbers with different key trading routes connecting broadly Central Asia and Calcutta. Right? And this was a very powerful trading route. As you know, a lot of invasions happened, a lot of trade happened on these routes, and the Marwadis became important brokers along this route. One of the most successful of these Marwadis is a person or a house called the House of Jagat Seth. And the House of Jagat Seth is infamously known for financing a person called Robert Clive in the Battle of Plassey. Merchants played a very, very important role in taking sides and aiding, of course, British entry into India. In a kind of ironic twist of fate, the Marwadis in particular were also instrumental in kicking the British out, right? Because Gandhi famously was financed by the Bajajs, by the Birlas, and a lot of the top Marwadi houses in the freedom movement. Between the 18th century and the early 20th century, the Marwadis started moving in large numbers to three core places. One was Calcutta, and that's why there's huge Calcutta Marwadi population even today, very dominant in the world of business of Calcutta. You have the Marwadis in Bombay or Mumbai, but you also have Marwadis in northern Maharashtra. In fact, the largest cluster of Marwadis today outside Rajasthan is in northern Maharashtra, districts like Dhule, Jalgaon, and so on. And because of these migrations, when they went to these areas, they became pretty much the dominant business firms of those times. For instance, when these migrations happened, people were very suspicious. People are always suspicious of traders and merchants. Some of you might have read Shakespeare and a book called The Merchant of Venice, in which there's a character called Shylock. And Shylock, the moneylender, is seen in negative terms. That's how a lot of these groups have been seen in India. The Marwadis were called parasites by the Bengali, Bhadralok in the early 20th century. In 1844, the Times of India, not called the Times of India then, but the Times of India ran an editorial in 1844 called Beware of the Marwadis. 100 years later, the group was owned by the Marwadis. Right? So this is how the dominance of this group kind of played out over the next 100 years. They start going into industry thanks to Birlas and various groups in the 20th century. But because of their position in Calcutta and because the bulk of big business was owned by the British in Calcutta, when the British left and when the British firms exited, who did they give their big firms to? The group sitting in Calcutta, which happened to be the Marwadis. So the Marwadis lucked out on a massive transfer of capital from the British purely on account of the fact that they were the dominant business group of Calcutta. And of course, a lot of Marwadis have left Calcutta now, as you know. Calcutta is now one of the slowest growing cities of India. There's been a lot of capital flight, and the Marwadis have gone to other places. Gujaratis, much more transnational. They've been to East Africa connections going back centuries. Gujaratis in South India, much more than the Marwadis. Right? Gujaratis in Tamil Nadu, in Coimbatore, in the textile firms of those places. Gujaratis outside India, much more than the Marwadis. Gujaratis in the US. So much so that a particular bank called the Bank of Baroda has its tagline, India's International Bank. Why is it called Bank of Baroda called the India's International Bank? Because it's the first bank which started going out in large numbers. Why? They were following the Gujaratis wherever they went around the world. That's how this bank kind of, establishes presence around the world. You have the Sindhis from Sindh, now Pakistan. Two big migration shocks, one in the 1700s, one partition, but a lot of fascinating stories in my book on the Sindhis. You have the Chettiars, which is again a community in South India, in Tamil Nadu, which became these massive, massive business lords of Burma. Unfortunately, the Chettiars lost their money when the Burmese kicked out the Indians. The Burmese nationalized assets, 1940s, 1950s. Chettiars, which was a dominant business group of Burma, lost all their money. Even today, there's a group in Tamil Nadu which wants its money back. Right? But the Chettiars, and note these communities are really tiny. We're a country of 1.4 billion people. We're saying Marwadis is a community outside Rajasthan of about 3 million people. Gujarati Banyas, about 5 to 10 million people. That is outside the state of Gujarat. You talk about Sindhis in a few 100,000. You talk about the Parsis, literally 60,000 Parsis. A really tiny group of people own a large number of businesses in India because, again, of this network and migration that has happened across centuries. Many other communities discussed in my book. There's a whole chapter called Migration and Capital where you can read up about that. In my book, I also talk about how Indians went around the world. I started this talk with the story of George Reynolds, Public Works Department manager, and how that's why Keralites got connected to the Gulf. But it's a really fascinating story of how Indians were taken to Fiji. Again, the governor there happened to have experience of running Mauritius. So when he was posted there, he said, where do I get labor from? India. Oftentimes, these connections happen purely out of serendipity. Indians in the Caribbean, Indians in Suriname. For example, if you go to Netherlands today, you have a community of Indians called the Hindustanis, 100,000 plus of them. They migrated from Suriname to Netherlands only in the 1970s. When they got independence from the Dutch, they had to make a choice and they chose to go to Netherlands. Right? So they had 100 years of back history because they went into the 19th century, and they now, of course, have some Indian roots. They look Indian, but in a way completely Surinamese. And of course, as this has happened, cultures have, some have assimilated, some have been very proud to maintain traditions. In Mauritius, some say that caste has dissolved. Many of you want to know, can the caste system ever go away? Interestingly, when these people went on the ships packed together, notions of untouchability disappeared. A lot of these rigid social norms of India, when transplanted in completely new settings, in some places, not all, seem to have disappeared. In some places, many of the norms continue. For example, extreme sun preference. Even in the US and Canada today, you find terrible ratios among kids just among Indian immigrants. Right? Now, labor migrations, Gulf, elite migrations, high-skill migrations, US. In the new age, of course, new countries are emerging. Many of you are probably aspiring to go to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, English-speaking countries. But interestingly, Italy is the big draw. Italy has about 200,000 Indians. It's a story which is not well known. It's a story which happened in the last 30 years. It's a story linked with the Punjabis and the dairy industry. Right? And again, the power of the network of them to move out there and grow substantially. So you'll find Indians now in virtually every country of the world, maybe barring North Korea. Right? If, of course, new enclaves are made outside the Earth or on Antarctica and so on, you'll be rest assured, that Indians will kind of reach there first. In fact, this idea of Indians being sent out deliberately because we are just too populous a country has also been there for a long time. A sociologist called Radhakamal Mukherjee wrote a book in the 1930s called Migrant Asia. And his solution to the population problem of Asia was, let the Indians and Chinese freely migrate everywhere. Right? Unfortunately, we run up against this severe thing called as immigration laws. And for the longest time, America had racist immigration laws. It's only when they repealed that in 1965 that Indians and Chinese started going in large numbers. We have our own immigration laws, as many of you know, right, which are not really the most welcoming. We love to criticize immigration policies of Saudi Arabia, of the US, but our country is also not doing great on the immigration front. Do we have a lot of immigrants? Actually, between 1970s and 1990s, India had more immigrants than emigrants. That's switched now. And most of our immigrants, of course, came from Bangladesh and Nepal. And of course, the Bangladeshi immigrant problem today, constructed by politicians in particular, is a huge flashpoint, right? But the numbers are minuscule today, and Bangladesh is growing very well. It's quite likely that in 20 years' time, Indians are migrating to Bangladesh. And that's how quickly these things can flip in the order of migration. In the world of migration in India, I can't have a talk without mentioning the word partition. right? Partition is I mentioned the world's largest voluntary migration, the Great Indian Migration Wave, which is about labor migration. But there were 3 partitions in the 20th century which fundamentally altered our landscape in particular regions. First was the partition of Burma, which we are usually not aware of. This happened in the late 1930s when Burma was taken away from British India. But when the Japanese attacked them in 1942, we got our first big refugee crisis. In 1942, refugees started to come into India from Burma. They had to walk because ships were not available. Terrible refugee crisis at that time. And then the world's largest refugee crisis, first the partition, 1947, of India, and 1971, the partition of Pakistan into Bangladesh and Pakistan, is till date the world's largest refugee crisis, where about 10 million people came into eastern India from Bangladesh. Most of them went back, but of course a lot of them settled. And that settlement, of course, has now become a big political flashpoint. You can't really understand the history of eastern India, the northeast, without understanding this history of mass migration. For example, Assam was one of the world's fastest growing regions in demographic terms between 1850 and 1950, because people went and settled Assam. And where they came from, of course, they maintained deep roots, but after independence, those new political alignments challenged those roots. So to understand various parts of India, to understand business, to understand music, to understand food, to understand economics, I do think you need a very, very good appreciation of the world of migration. I'll end here with this kind of thought on migration and development. Is migration good or bad? And I'll look at it from 3 perspectives. First, the Gandhian perspective. Gandhi had this vision of India living in village republics. He did not like big cities. For that matter, he did not like urban life as much. He extolled the virtues of rural life. For him, rural to urban migration, unless you were escaping caste oppression, he was very clear about that, rural to urban migration was something not to be seen as positive. Right? That is, if only we gave all facilities in the villages, why would anybody want to move to the city? Let us celebrate rural development. And Gandhian philosophy has been in part of our overall policy making documents for the longest time, I would say until about 15 years back. In fact, when I wrote an exam called the NET exam, to qualify as a teacher, you have to give an exam called the NET exam. It's a horrendous exam. The first question I got on my question paper was, state the problems associated with rural to urban migration. Not critically evaluate, but state the problems. We just think that migration is a problem. And so to this question, I wrote a long answer saying it's not a problem. In fact, it's a great thing. We need more migration, not less. I failed the exam, but that's a separate point. This idea that migration is bad has some roots in Gandhi's perspective, and it gets a new traction today from the environmentalists, right, who say that this material life of urban life is environmentally disastrous, and we need to live in our villages. In complete contrast, you have the Ambedkarite move, right? And the Ambedkar was very clear: migration is fantastic. It was fantastic for his own personal upliftment. He studied in various places across the world. Migration, he called famously, what is a village but a den of ignorance? You need to go to cities, right? Like we say in Mumbai, you can't really practice untouchability in the Bombay local train. You're just all jam-packed together. Does caste wither away in cities? Of course not. A lot of studies which show, but it is qualitatively very different. There are measures on segregation which will tell you that the average village in India is completely segregated by caste. In cities, of course, there's segregation, but less at the neighborhood scale. So Ambedkar's perspective is, migration is good. This is how we defeat caste. So 2 completely different perspectives. A middle perspective, interestingly, is a guy called Bal Thackeray. Many of you might have heard of a guy called Bal Thackeray. And Bal Thackeray had a very clear view saying, what is migration? People from outside coming, we have to protect our local interests. The idea of sons of the soil, which is not just limited to Shiv Sena, but a lot of political parties around the world. Donald Trump, for instance, a lot of political parties in India. And you'll see this sons of the soil, daughters of the soil element creeping in more and more in our polity. Of course, our constitution allows freedom of mobility, but it's the classic whipping point. If things are going bad, blame someone from outside. Right? And as a result, there's a growing anti-migrant sentiment in India across political parties, across manifestos. You'll see all political parties are now saying 75% job reservation for locals. Right? That's a huge draw in many parts of India. Andhra Pradesh has just passed a law on that. It's being challenged in the courts and so on. So Shiv Sen, of course, was the ultimate expression of that in the 1960s. Much later on, of course, the target initially was South Indians. The target later on became, North Indians and so on. And in the ultimate irony, of course, when Bal Thackeray died, there's a movie based on Bal Thackeray, right? And who plays Bal Thackeray in that movie? Any idea? There's an actor called Nawazuddin Siddiqui, who is a migrant worker in Bombay, from Uttar Pradesh, which is a classic kind of a tribute to somebody playing a person like Bal Thackeray. Which again tells you that, the people who made that film chose value of work, quality over any other consideration. And that is what people do in the world of migration. I'll end here with a personal note, which is my surname. My name is Chinmay Tumbe. And my surname is a completely concocted surname in the sense that Tumbe happens to be the name of a village near Udupi, my father's side. And in Maharashtrian circles, you have a Tembe and a Tambe, but there are no Tumbes, right? And we happen to live next to the Thackeray's in Shivaji Park in Mumbai. And in the 1960s, in the anti-South Indian movement, we happened to choose a surname, and Tumbe sounds Maharashtrian. Most people, in fact, come to me and say, "Are you Maharashtrian?" And I am Maharashtrian because my mother is Maharashtrian. But the name, in fact, comes from a village near Udupi, right? And we chose a surname to fit in with the locals, which is often what migration is all about, is about clever assimilation in a variety of ways. So from personal identity to the food we eat, to the music we hear, to the films we watch, to the games we play, to the ideologies we believe in, to the economics we practice, to the firms that we see on our hoarding boards, there is a migration story everywhere. And if you want to know more about that, please read my book. It's called India Moving, A History of Migration, available at the bookshop. Thank you.